Hi, this is Jack Duval, CEO of Bantam Incorporated, a private investment office in New York. Today's video is another in our risk management series. And in particular, I want to talk about one of the ways that I believe in controlling risk, and that is to eliminate complexity. So let's talk about, let's just define complexity first. So in my mind, investment complexity is the potential for an investment to behave very differently than you think it will. And that's a bit of a deceptive definition, because obviously if a investment behaves differently than you think it will, you'll be surprised by it. But you can identify complexity before you make an investment, and you can choose not to make that investment. So, for instance, complex investments are things that are usually combinations of different investments into one package, and then you invest in the package. So structured products are a version of that, where they use a bunch of options and or futures contracts to create a synthetic investment that is supposed to give you a certain exposure and or certain guarantees on the principal. And those from time to time have gone to zero, even when they're supposed to be principal guaranteed. So that's a good example of an investment behaving differently than you thought. You thought you might get a certain fixed return or a variable return up to a certain percentage, and your downside would be defined to a very limited amount, maybe 10%, and then it goes to zero. That's an example of complexity risk that when it's realized. So complexity has other problems with it. In my experience, Wall Street uses complexity to hide risks and to hide fees. And when you buy an investment that has a big prospectus that is written in legalese and deals with finance terms and accounting terms, and of course legal terms all together, those documents are written on a PhD level, and that's literally something that is quantifiable, and I've done considerable work in this arena. And you have to be an insider in order to understand it. So those prospectuses are required to be delivered, but they're really impenetrable for the layman. Those investments are typically best to be avoided, in my experience. So how do you manage complexity? Well, the way that we do it is, number one, if we are going to invest in a complex investment, before we do any of that, we define a complexity budget. We say, okay, of the amount of assets that we're going to invest, how much of that can be in complex investments? And in my experience, less is more. So you define how much you want to have in complex investments, and then you don't go beyond that. So that's the first way to control complexity risk, is to have that budget for the complexity risk. The second thing is, there's another type of complexity that comes out of having a large number of holdings, because it becomes very difficult to follow all those holdings and to manage it, even for a professional. I've had clients who were with other firms before being with Bantam, and they had literally, well in excess of 20 accounts, maybe 25 accounts, and they would get a 530-page statement every month, literally. And it was, a good inch thick every month, and it's completely impenetrable for the client. So there's no need for that. That comes out of having a lot of different separately managed accounts. And so of course they have So if they're equity accounts, they have, maybe 50 to 100 different equities, and you have 10 of those managers, there's 500 positions right there. There's no need to have that. You could have one ETF that has the exact same exposure that that manager has, and probably would outperform that manager on an after fee basis. If the manager's a large cap value manager, you could just have the large cap value ETF. And I've also seen a lot of Wall Street portfolios where the broker's running it or the investment advisor. And there's just so many different positions in it. It's like whatever the flavor of the month is, the client ends up with that for a few years, and then they've got a portfolio with 50 different holdings. And at the end of the day, all the risk assets in there are highly, highly correlated. So it doesn't really give them diversification. They've got like an ETF or a fund that specializes in cybersecurity. Okay, that might be a good investment. But then they've got 10 different versions of those with all these other little kind of specialty niches. And at the end of the day, it all ends up just being the S&P 500. That's it, up or down. So you want to control that. And in our portfolios, you just don't need that many holdings. You can do fine with 5 or 6, certainly 10 at the outside. 10 holdings would give you plenty of diversification, depending on what kind of holdings they are. Like I said, you can buy an ETF that itself has exposure to, 100 or 1,000 or 3,000 stocks. You don't need to own all those. So so complexity is a real killer of investment returns. You want to avoid it at all costs. And there's some simple ways to do that. This is Jack Duval. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for watching.